The frost in upstate New York did not arrive with a whisper. It arrived with a sudden, biting finality that demanded respect. For Scarlett, the cold was not an enemy, but a familiar companion, a sharp reminder of the Earth's necessary cycles of rest and renewal. At 64, she found a strange comfort in the winter garden. There was an honesty to it that the blooming hysteria of spring lacked. She stood in the center of her modest backyard, the pale morning sun casting long blue shadows across the frosted grass. She wore a thick charcoal gray wool cardigan over a simple linen tunic, her silver-threaded hair pulled back into a neat, elegant knot at the nape of her neck. Her hands, encased in worn leather gardening gloves, moved with a practiced, rhythmic precision. In her right hand, she held a pair of forged steel pruning shears. Scarlett was working on the Rosa sericea, a stubborn, beautiful variety of wild rose that her late husband, Robert, had planted 3 decades ago. It was a plant that required a firm, unsentimental hand. If you did not cut back the dead wood, the rot would spread, suffocating the healthy branches and stealing the energy required for the next season's bloom. Snip! A brittle, blackened branch fell to the frozen earth. Snip! Another followed. "You have to be willing to lose parts of it to save the whole," Robert used to say, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. He had been a man of quiet profundity, a man who understood that true growth often required painful severing. Scarlett paused, her breath pluming in the frigid air, and allowed herself a brief, solitary moment to miss him. 15 years had passed since his heart had simply stopped while he was reading in his favorite armchair, but his absence still occupied a physical space in her life. Like a heavy piece of furniture, she had simply learned to walk around. She stripped off a glove and ran her bare thumb over a dormant bud. Her skin was a rich, deep mahogany, marked by the faint maps of age and a lifetime of labor. She had spent 30 years as a high school literature teacher, shaping minds, demanding excellence, and navigating the often exhausting politics of being a black woman in predominantly white academic spaces. She had earned her retirement. She had earned her peace. But society, she had found, had a peculiar way of dealing with aging women, particularly those who no longer served an immediate, exhausting purpose. You were expected to shrink. You were expected to fade into a pastel-colored background, to become a soft, pliable grandmother who existed only to dispense cookies and convenient childcare, smiling placidly as the world rushed past. Scarlett had never been pliable, and she certainly was not pastel. As she bent to gather the discarded branches, the sharp, artificial trill of a ringtone shattered the morning silence. It was not her phone. The sound bled through the thin wooden fence separating her modest property from the neighboring lot, though the call she was meant to take later that day would carry the exact same manic energy. Across the county, in the sprawling, aggressively manicured suburbs of Westchester, her daughter-in-law, Chloe, was having what she liked to call an aesthetic crisis. No. I specifically said champagne gold, Julian. This is yellow. This looks like cheap brass. I cannot have cheap brass at a Gatsby party. Chloe paced the length of her sterile, white-on-white kitchen, the stiletto heels of her indoor boots clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble. At 34, Chloe was a masterpiece of modern suburban anxiety. She was a woman who lived her life entirely for an audience that she simultaneously feared and desperately wanted to join. Her hair was highlighted to a precise, expensive ash blonde, her skin meticulously preserved by quarterly Botox and chemical peels. She was, by all societal standards, striking. But beneath the polished veneer there was a frantic, clawing energy, a deep-seated terror of being exposed as ordinary. "Julian, you don't understand," Chloe hissed into her AirPods, aggressively adjusting a vase of white orchids on the kitchen island. "Eleanor Vance might be coming. Yes, that Eleanor, the lifestyle editor. If she sees yellow gold balloons looking like a child's birthday party in my foyer, my reputation in the country club committee is dead. Fix it. I don't care what it costs. Just fix it." She ended the call with a frustrated sigh, pressing her fingertips to her temples. Her house, a sprawling 5-bedroom McMansion with unnecessary columns and too many windows, felt like a movie set. Every throw pillow was karate chopped to perfection. Every coffee table book, which had never been opened, was stacked with geometric precision. It was a home designed to be photographed, not lived in. And looming over this perfectly curated stage was the impending Christmas Eve party. This was not a family gathering. This was a strategic networking event, a calculated move to solidify her and Marcus's status among the local elite. They were inviting the managing partners of Marcus's tech firm, the board members of the country club, and the local old money families. It was to be a night of caviar, vintage champagne, and jazz played by a string quartet. There was only one problem in Chloe's grand design: Scarlett. Chloe leaned against the marble counter, biting her impeccably manicured thumbnail. She didn't hate her mother-in-law. Hatred required a level of passion Chloe reserved only for rival PTA mothers. What she felt toward Scarlett was a profound, suffocating discomfort. Scarlett was too quiet, too observant. When Scarlett looked at her, Chloe felt as though the older woman could see right through the designer labels and the affected accent, straight down to the insecure middle-class girl from Ohio who was terrified of not being enough. Worse still, Scarlett simply didn't fit the aesthetic. Scarlett wore sensible shoes. She clipped grocery coupons out of habit despite having a comfortable pension. She didn't care about the difference between a BMW and a Mercedes, and she certainly didn't know how to navigate the subtle, passive-aggressive banter of wealthy suburban housewives. Having Scarlett at the Gatsby party, a black woman in her 60s who spoke with the deliberate, measured cadence of a retired educator and refused to play the role of the subservient, invisible elder, would throw the entire delicate social ecosystem out of balance. Chloe's friends would offer pitying smiles. They would ask condescending questions. It would be a disaster. It's just not her crowd, Chloe whispered to herself, rationalizing the plan she had been cultivating for weeks. She'd be miserable anyway. It's an act of kindness, really. She walked over to the entryway table and picked up a sleek silver envelope. It felt heavy. It felt like a solution. The drive to Marcus and Chloe's house was exactly 45 minutes, a transition from the quiet, tree-lined streets of Scarlett's neighborhood to the imposing gated enclaves of Westchester. Scarlett drove her 10-year-old Volvo Estate, a vehicle built for safety and endurance, not for making a statement. It ran perfectly, largely because Scarlett maintained it with the same meticulous care she applied to her garden. It was a week before Christmas, the night of their intimate family dinner, before the chaos of the holiday season truly began. The sky was the color of bruised iron, promising snow. Scarlett had the heater on low, a classical piano sonata playing softly from the radio. In the passenger seat sat a carefully wrapped tin of homemade sweet potato biscuits, an old family recipe passed down from her grandmother. It was a peace offering, a bridge she continually tried to build despite knowing the planks would likely be torn up by the end of the night. She pulled up to the wrought iron gates of Whispering Pines Estates, rolling down her window to speak to the security guard. "Evening, Mrs. Hayes," the guard, an older man named Frank, said with a warm smile. "Visiting the son?" "Good evening, Frank. Yes, just for dinner," Scarlett replied, her voice rich and melodic. "Stay warm out there. Supposed to drop below freezing tonight." The gates swung open, admitting her into a world where the lawns were artificially green even in December, and the houses looked like fortresses of new money. She parked the Volvo in the sprawling driveway, noting how it looked like a drab gray pebble next to Chloe's gleaming white Range Rover and Marcus's sleek Tesla. Taking a deep breath, Scarlett picked up her tin of biscuits and stepped out into the cold. Before she could even ring the bell, the heavy mahogany door swung open. Chloe stood there, wearing a cashmere lounge set that probably cost more than Scarlett's first car. She smelled heavily of a synthetic, expensive room spray, something intended to smell like pine, but which only managed to smell like chemicals and desperation. "Mother Scarlett, you're exactly on time, as always," Chloe said, her voice an octave higher than natural, her smile bright and entirely disconnected from her eyes. She leaned in for an air kiss, carefully avoiding actual physical contact. "Hello, Chloe. You look lovely. I brought the sweet potato biscuits Marcus loves," Scarlett said, extending the tin. Chloe looked at the humble tin as if Scarlett had handed her a live grenade. "Oh, how rustic. Thank you. I'll just put these in the pantry. We're doing a strict keto-friendly low-carb menu tonight, but I'm sure Marcus will sneak one later when his trainer isn't looking." Scarlett let the insult slide off her like water off a duck's back. It was a familiar dance. Chloe didn't attack with swords. She attacked with 1,000 tiny paper cuts, delivered with a smile. Come in, take your coat off," Chloe ushered her inside. "Marcus is in his office. He's been putting out fires all day. You know how it is. Being a senior VP is basically a 24/7 crisis management job." Scarlett hung her own wool coat in the immaculate closet. The house was freezing, the thermostat set low to accommodate the roaring, gas-powered fireplace that produced no real heat, only aesthetic flames. The living room was a sea of white and silver. There were no photographs of family, no cluttered bookshelves, no signs of life, only curated art pieces and structural floral arrangements. "Marcus!" Chloe called out, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Your mother is here!" A door down the hall opened and Marcus emerged. At 40, Marcus was a handsome man, inheriting his father's broad shoulders and Scarlett's sharp, intelligent eyes. But there was a permanent exhaustion etched into his features. He wore a rumpled dress shirt, his tie loosened, a phone permanently grafted to his left hand. "Mom, hey," he said, walking over and giving her a quick, one-armed hug. He didn't meet her eyes. "Traffic bad?" "Not at all. The roads were quite clear," Scarlett said, studying her son. She loved him fiercely. She had worked double shifts after Robert died to ensure Marcus graduated from an Ivy League university without crippling debt. She had taught him to be strong, to be principled, to stand up for himself and for others. But somewhere along the line, in his climb up the corporate ladder and his marriage to Chloe, Marcus had misplaced his spine. He had adopted a policy of appeasement. It was easier to agree with Chloe, easier to stay late at the office, easier to look at his phone than to confront the uncomfortable realities of his own home. He had become a ghost in his own life. "Sorry, I'm distracted," Marcus said, tapping at his screen. "Merger talks. It's a bloodbath." "Take your time, son. The world will keep spinning," Scarlett said gently. Dinner was served in the formal dining room. The table was large enough to seat 12, but only 3 places were set at one end, making the space feel even more isolating. The meal was an exercise in culinary pretension. Seared scallops that were slightly rubbery, a foam of some unrecognizable vegetable, and a salad of bitter microgreens. Scarlett ate quietly, her posture perfect. "So, Mother Scarlett," Chloe began, swirling her sparkling water, "I noticed you're wearing that gray cardigan again. It's so resilient. You must have had that for what, a decade? You really should let me take you shopping at Neiman's. They have a lovely mature women's section. Very elasticated, very comfortable." "Thank you, Chloe, but I am quite attached to this sweater. Robert bought it for me in Scotland. The wool is exceptional," Scarlett replied, her tone even, refusing to rise to the bait. Marcus kept his eyes glued to his plate, chewing methodically. "Right, Scotland. How historic," Chloe murmured, taking a tiny bite of a scallop. "Well, speaking of history, we were just talking about the country club. The board is so traditional. Sometimes I think they're a bit too traditional, if you know what I mean. It takes so much effort to fit into their mold." It was a subtle, insidious comment. Chloe was constantly reminding Scarlett of the social chasm between them. She was reminding Scarlett that in this world of old money and white privilege, Chloe was fighting for a seat at the table, and Scarlett was an anchor dragging her down. "I have always found," Scarlett said, setting her fork down with a soft clink, "that people who spend their lives trying to fit into molds usually end up breaking themselves in the process. True elegance doesn't require an application form." Marcus coughed suddenly, reaching for his water. Chloe's smile tightened, her eyes flashing with a cold, brief fury. "How philosophical, Mother Scarlett. You always have such quaint ways of looking at the world. It must be so peaceful, living such a simple, uncomplicated life in that little neighborhood of yours." The rest of the main course passed in a stifling silence, punctuated only by the scrape of silverware against imported porcelain and the occasional buzz of Marcus's phone, which he checked with the desperation of a drowning man looking for a life raft. Scarlett watched them both. She saw the tension in Chloe's neck, the bags under Marcus's eyes. They had everything money could buy, and they were utterly miserable. But their misery was toxic, and they were constantly looking for a place to offload it. Scarlett knew she was their chosen dumping ground. She just didn't know how far they were willing to go tonight. When the plates were cleared, Chloe brought out dessert. It was a visually stunning, architecturally complex slice of opera cake that had clearly been purchased from a high-end patisserie, though Chloe presented it on her own serving platter with a flourish that implied she had labored over it all afternoon. "And now for the real treat," Chloe announced. Her voice had taken on a new, breathless quality. The manic energy was back, dialed up to a dangerous frequency. She didn't sit down. Instead, she walked over to the sideboard and picked up the heavy silver envelope Scarlett had noticed earlier. She returned to the table, standing behind Marcus's chair, her manicured hands resting lightly on his shoulders. Marcus went rigidly still. He stopped chewing. He didn't look up. but Scarlett saw his jaw clench. He knew what was in the envelope. He was complicit. That realization, that her son knew and had agreed to whatever humiliation was about to occur, settled like a stone in Scarlett's stomach. But her face remained an unreadable mask of polite inquiry. "Mother Scarlett," Chloe began, her smile radiant and entirely weaponized. "As you know, Marcus and I are hosting our annual Christmas Eve party next week, the Gatsby theme." "Yes, I remember you mentioning it," Scarlett said calmly. "Well, the thing is," Chloe continued, her voice dripping with faux concern and sticky sweetness, "the guest list has just exploded. Marcus's partners are bringing their wives, the country club board is coming, and it's going to be incredibly loud, incredibly crowded, and honestly, quite chaotic. Very corporate. Lots of shop talk and heavy drinking." Chloe paused, letting the words hang in the air. She was setting the stage, building the narrative where she was the benevolent savior protecting the fragile elderly woman. "Marcus and I were talking, and we just felt so terrible at the thought of you being stuck in a corner, feeling overwhelmed and out of place. You're so used to your quiet routines. We didn't want to subject you to all that noise and, well, that kind of fast-paced environment." Scarlett looked at Marcus. "Is that what you thought, Marcus? That I would be overwhelmed?" Marcus swallowed hard. His eyes darted to his mother for a fraction of a second before snapping back to his half-eaten cake. It's going to be a zoo, Mom. Mostly clients. You'd be bored to tears." His voice was hollow, lacking any conviction. He was parroting a script Chloe had written for him. "Exactly," Chloe chimed in, squeezing Marcus's shoulder approvingly. She slid the silver envelope across the polished mahogany table until it stopped inches from Scarlett's plate. "So we wanted to do something really special for you. An early Christmas present. We want you to have a holiday that is actually relaxing and tailored to your needs." Scarlett looked down at the envelope. The paper was thick, embossed with silver foil. Slowly, with deliberate grace, she picked it up. She broke the seal and slid out a glossy, heavy cardstock brochure and a personalized voucher. The elegant cursive font at the top of the brochure read, "Silver Pine Senior Solstice Retreat, a rejuvenating holiday experience for the golden years." Below the text were stock photos of elderly white people in matching pastel tracksuits, doing water aerobics, playing bingo, and sitting in rocking chairs looking vacantly out at a frozen lake. The voucher was for a 5-day, 4-night stay, covering the exact dates of the Christmas week. It included meals, light mobility activities, and a complimentary orthopedic massage. The silence in the dining room became absolute. The humming of the refrigerator in the distant kitchen sounded like an airplane engine. Chloe had not just uninvited her mother-in-law to Christmas. She had packaged the rejection in wrapping paper and called it a gift. She had effectively told Scarlett that she was too old, too out of place, and too embarrassing to be seen around their high society friends. And she had paid good money to have Scarlett shipped off to a facility where she would be safely out of sight, surrounded by people waiting out their final days. Scarlett stared at the brochure. A lesser woman might have cried. A more volatile woman might have thrown the opera cake at Chloe's perfectly highlighted head. Scarlett felt the sting, a sharp, deep laceration in her chest that bled invisible blood. The pain didn't come from missing the party. She had zero desire to stand in a room full of pretentious strangers. The pain came from the utter disrespect. It came from her son sitting there, a silent accomplice to his mother's erasure. She took a slow, deep breath, drawing the cold air of the room into her lungs. When she finally looked up, her dark eyes were clear, steady, and terrifyingly calm. She did not look at Chloe. She looked directly at her son. "Marcus," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a quiet resonance that commanded the space. "Look at me." For a terrible moment, he resisted. Then, slowly, painfully, Marcus lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, swimming with a mixture of guilt and a pathetic plea for understanding. He looked like a little boy who had broken a window and was waiting for the punishment. "Is this your wish?" Scarlett asked. Every word was articulated perfectly. "That I spend Christmas at a senior care facility while you entertain your clients?" "Mom, it's not a care facility, it's a luxury retreat," Marcus started, his voice cracking. "Answer the question, Marcus. Is this what you want?" Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, and looked helplessly at his wife. Chloe stepped in, her smile faltering slightly under the weight of Scarlett's intense composure. "Mother Scarlett, please don't make this difficult. We paid a fortune for this. It's the premium package. We thought you'd be thrilled to get away from the cold and the stress. It's for your own good. You just don't fit into the dynamic of this particular event, and we didn't want you to feel bad." Scarlett finally shifted her gaze to Chloe. The younger woman instinctively took a half-step back. There was no anger in Scarlett's face. There was only a chilling, absolute clarity. "Chloe," Scarlett said softly, "you have spent a great deal of time and money trying to convince me that I am a burden. You have tried to make me feel small, so that your own life might feel larger." "I have done no such thing," Chloe gasped, pressing a hand to her chest in a pantomime of shock. "How can you be so ungrateful?" Scarlett ignored her. She neatly folded the brochure back into the silver envelope. She did not toss it back across the table. Instead, she placed it precisely next to her untouched dessert plate. She stood up. She smoothed the front of her resilient, decades-old Scottish wool cardigan. She stood tall, her spine a rod of iron, radiating a dignity that made the expensive furniture and the imported marble seem cheap and flimsy by comparison. "You do not need to worry about my comfort, Chloe, and you certainly do not need to manage my schedule," Scarlett said, her voice ringing with the quiet authority of a queen dismissing a foolish courtier. "I will not be attending your party, nor will I be attending your retreat. I have my own plans for the holidays." "Plans?" Chloe scoffed, unable to stop herself. "What plans? Staying home and watching television?" Scarlett looked at them both, taking in the pathetic tableau they presented. A husband and wife bound together not by love, but by a shared, desperate vanity. "I will be exactly where I am meant to be," Scarlett said. "With people who understand the difference between price and value." She turned and walked out of the dining room. Her footsteps were steady on the hardwood floor. She retrieved her coat from the closet, slipped it on, and walked out the heavy front door, closing it behind her with a definitive, solid click. She did not slam it. Slamming was for people who had lost control. Scarlett had just taken hers back. When she got into the old Volvo, the cold interior was a shock to her system. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning ashy white. Only then did a single hot tear escape, tracking down her cheek. She wiped it away immediately with the back of her leather glove. She started the engine. The classical music resumed its gentle melody. As she drove back through the wrought iron gates of Whispering Pines Estates, Scarlett looked in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at her was not a fragile grandmother. She was a woman who had survived far worse than the petty cruelties of an insecure daughter-in-law. "All right, Chloe," Scarlett whispered to the empty car, a small, dangerous smile touching the corners of her mouth. "You want to play a game of aesthetics in class. Let me show you how it's really done." She merged onto the highway, her mind already shifting gears, calculating timelines and visualizing the historic, sprawling estate hidden in the upstate woods, a masterpiece of a secret she had kept for 15 years. The pruning was finished. It was time for the roses to bloom. The morning of December 23rd arrived with a brittle, crystalline cold that seemed to freeze the very air in the suburbs. Scarlett stood in the bedroom of her modest 3-bedroom house, the house where she had raised Marcus, the house where she had held Robert's hand as he took his final breath. It was a good house, filled with good memories, but today it felt remarkably small. On the neatly made bed lay 2 pieces of luggage. They were not the sensible nylon suitcases one might expect a retired schoolteacher to take on a senior bus tour. They were vintage caramel-colored leather valises, the leather supple and scored with the faint scratches of decades of international travel. Inside, she had not packed elastic waist pastel tracksuits or orthopedic walking shoes. She had packed a breathtaking emerald green velvet gown, a pair of bespoke Italian leather boots, heavy cashmere sweaters in rich, deep jewel tones, and a string of flawless heirloom pearls that Robert had bought for her at an auction in Geneva. She zipped the valises with a satisfying finality. By 9 o'clock, Scarlett was behind the wheel of her Volvo, driving away from the cookie-cutter neighborhoods of Westchester. She did not head toward the designated pickup location for the Silver Pines Senior Solstice Retreat. She took the on-ramp for the northbound interstate, pointing the heavy grille of her car toward the rugged, rising elevations of upstate New York. As the miles spooled out beneath her tires, the landscape began to transform. The manicured lawns and identical strip malls of the affluent suburbs gradually gave way to sprawling stretches of untamed forest, dormant farmland, and the majestic, icy expanse of the Hudson River. The sky was a heavy, bruised violet, pregnant with the promise of a serious snowstorm. Scarlett turned off the radio, letting the steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump-thump of the tires over the asphalt fill the silence. She thought about Chloe's silver envelope. It was still sitting on her kitchen counter back home, a monument to arrogance. Scarlett felt no anger anymore. Anger was a hot, chaotic emotion that burned out quickly. What she felt was a cold, crystalline resolve. She had spent 5 years playing a role, the quiet, unassuming, financially conservative widow, because she had wanted to see who Marcus would become when he thought there was nothing left to inherit. She had wanted to see if the moral foundation she and Robert had painstakingly laid could withstand the corrosive, relentless pressure of Chloe's materialistic ambition. The answer, delivered with a slice of opera cake and a retreat brochure, was a devastating no. Marcus had failed the test, but Scarlett was not a woman who wallowed in defeat. If her son had chosen the illusion of wealth over the reality of family, she would simply retreat to a reality he could not possibly comprehend. 3 hours later, the Volvo turned off the main highway onto a winding 2-lane county road that snaked through a dense canopy of ancient hemlocks and bare, silver-barked birches. The snow had begun to fall, thick, heavy flakes that coated the world in a pristine, blinding white. Scarlett slowed the car, searching for a landmark that no GPS would ever identify. Finally, she saw it. A pair of massive wrought iron gates, completely overgrown with dormant ivy and seemingly abandoned at the edge of the woods. There was no sign, no brass plaque announcing the property. To anyone driving past, it looked like the forgotten entrance to a ruined estate. Scarlett pressed a button on the sun visor. With a deep mechanical groan that echoed through the silent woods, the heavy iron gates slowly swung inward, revealing a private, gravel-lined driveway that disappeared into the trees. She drove through, the gates closing securely behind her, locking the rest of the world out. The driveway wound through the forest for nearly a mile, climbing a steep incline before finally breaking through the tree line. When the property came into view, it was not a rotting pile of wood, as Chloe had once so eloquently described it 5 years ago when Scarlett had first mentioned buying a fixer-upper in the country. Rising against the backdrop of the snow-dusted Catskill Mountains stood Ironwood Manor. It was a breathtaking masterpiece of historic restoration and architectural brilliance. Originally built in the late 1700s as a working farm, Scarlett had transformed the sprawling 50-acre property into an estate that defined the very concept of rustic elegance. The main house was a massive structure of hand-hewn local stone and reclaimed timber. The roof was slate, pitched steep against the snow, with 3 massive stone chimneys pluming fragrant wood smoke into the winter sky. Floor-to-ceiling windows, engineered to withstand the harshest blizzards while offering unobstructed views of the valley, reflected the silver light of the afternoon. It was a property that would have made the editors of Architectural Digest weep with joy. It was quiet, grounded, and terrifyingly expensive. How does a retired high school teacher afford a multi-million-dollar historic estate? The answer lay in the brilliant, quiet mind of Robert Hayes. Robert had been an engineer, but his true genius was in foresight. In the late 1980s and early 90s, while his colleagues were buying flashy cars and upgrading to bigger suburban homes, Robert had quietly, methodically invested every spare dollar into a handful of fledgling technology startups. He didn't talk about it. He didn't boast. When those startups eventually went public and exploded into global tech titans, Robert didn't cash out to buy a yacht. Instead, he established an irrevocable, airtight, blind trust. He funneled the staggering returns into diversified, low-risk municipal bonds, sustainable real estate, and conservation funds. He had ensured that his wife would be insulated from financial ruin, from predatory opportunists, and, most importantly, from the corrupting influence of sudden, visible wealth. "Money is a megaphone, Scarlett," he had told her one night, looking over the trust documents. "It amplifies exactly who you already are. If you are a fool, it makes you a colossal fool. If you are kind, it allows you to be boundlessly kind. Let's keep the megaphone in the closet until we absolutely need it." When Robert died, Scarlett became the sole controller of an empire worth tens of millions. But she had kept her modest house, kept her Volvo, and kept her coupons. She had used a fraction of the trust's dividends to purchase Ironwood and spend 5 years meticulously restoring it, employing the finest historic preservationists and local craftsmen. It was her sanctuary. It was the physical manifestation of her soul, strong, deeply rooted in history, and utterly uncompromising. Scarlett parked the Volvo in the heated detached carriage house, which currently housed her actual daily driver, a pristine dark navy Range Rover autobiography that she only drove upstate. As she walked up the sweeping stone steps to the main entrance, the heavy oak door swung open before she could reach for her keys. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes," a warm voice called out. Standing in the doorway was Thomas, the estate manager. A rugged, capable man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a thick wool sweater, Thomas and his wife Sarah lived in the guest cottage on the edge of the property, maintaining Ironwood year-round. They were fiercely loyal to Scarlett, not just because she paid them exceptionally well, but because she treated them like family, demanding their opinions on the garden and sharing meals with them in the kitchen. "Thomas, it is so good to see you," Scarlett smiled, stepping into the grand foyer. The interior of Ironwood was a study in warmth and texture. The floors were wide plank chestnut, salvaged from a dismantled barn and polished to a dull, rich glow. Persian rugs in deep reds and indigos absorbed the sound of her footsteps. The walls were painted in warm, earthy tones, hung with original works by Black American artists, painters and sculptors Scarlett had patronized over the years. To her left was the great room, anchored by a massive walk-in stone fireplace where a fire was already roaring, casting dancing orange light across the plush velvet sofas and the towering, unadorned 12-foot Christmas tree in the corner. There was no plastic. There were no metallic balloons. There was only the scent of fresh pine, wood smoke, and beeswax candles. "Sarah is in the kitchen," Thomas said, taking her leather valises. "She's been fussing over the menu since you called yesterday, and the deliveries from the local farms have been arriving all morning." "Excellent," Scarlett said, shedding her coat. "Let's get to work. We have a party to host." Scarlett walked down the long corridor toward the kitchen, the true heart of the house. It was a chef's dream, featuring commercial-grade appliances cleverly disguised behind custom oak cabinetry, a massive butcher block island, and a wall of windows looking out over the snow-covered orchards. Sarah, a woman with a booming laugh and flour dusting her apron, looked up from a massive cast-iron Dutch oven. "Scarlett, thank the Lord you're here. I need a taste tester for the cider glaze. The heritage turkey just arrived from Miller's farm, and it is a beast." "It smells like heaven in here, Sarah," Scarlett said, walking over and inhaling the rich aroma of roasting root vegetables, fresh rosemary, and simmering butter. Unlike Chloe, who was currently terrorizing caterers over the exact geometric shape of her keto-friendly canapes, Scarlett was rolling up her sleeves. The menu for tomorrow's Christmas Eve dinner was an homage to the land and to her heritage. There would be a massive pasture-raised turkey glazed in local apple cider and bourbon, cornbread dressing with sage and spicy sausage, roasted winter squashes dripping with maple syrup, braised collard greens slow-cooked with smoked turkey wings, and a crown jewel of a prime rib roast. It was food meant to be eaten with joy, not photographed for social media validation. "Have the wine deliveries been sorted?" Scarlett asked, tying a linen apron over her clothes. "Thomas brought up 3 cases from the cellar," Sarah confirmed. "The 1998 Chateauneuf-du-Pape you requested and the Reserve Pinot Noir from Oregon." Scarlett nodded, her hands already busy peeling a mountain of sweet potatoes. As she worked alongside Sarah, the quiet rhythm of the kitchen soothing her frayed nerves, she began to make her phone calls. She didn't have an event planner. She didn't send out embossed silver foil invitations. She simply pulled out her phone and called her people. Her first call was to Reverend Elias Jenkins. Elias was a towering 70-year-old black man with a voice that could shake the rafters of his small, historic church in a neighboring county. When Robert had first fallen ill, before the tech stocks had matured, money had been tight. Elias had sat with Scarlett in the hospital waiting room for days, bringing her soup, praying with her, and refusing to let her succumb to despair. "Scarlett, my dear," Elias's rich baritone boomed through the speaker. "Tell me you are safe from this snow." "I am at Ironwood, Elias. The fires are lit," Scarlett said, a genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. "I know it is short notice, but I am hosting dinner tomorrow night. I need you and Martha at the head of the table. I won't take no for an answer." "Try and stop us," Elias laughed. "Martha has been looking for an excuse to wear her new silk wrap. We will be there by 5. Next, she called Dr. Eris Thorne, a renowned art historian and the director of a regional museum that Scarlett quietly funded through her trust. Eris was a brilliant, eccentric man who preferred the company of 19th-century portraits to modern socialites. Eris, put down the catalog, Scarlett commanded gently when he answered. You are coming to Ironwood for Christmas Eve. Bring your cello. We need live music, and I refuse to listen to a Spotify playlist. Only if you promise to open that ridiculous French vintage you've been hoarding, Eris shot back, delight evident in his voice. I'll be there, Scarlett. She continued down her list. She invited Maya, a young, fierce local architect who had helped Scarlett navigate the complex historical preservation permits for the estate. She invited the Millers, the farming family who supplied the estate with their organic produce and meats, folks who worked the earth with their hands and possessed a quiet, unshakable dignity. She invited her fellow board members from the Regional Heritage Society, people who fought tooth and nail to preserve the history of marginalized communities in the state. In total, she invited 24 people. Not a single one of them was a corporate VP. Not a single one of them cared what brand of shoes she was wearing. They were a curated family of intellect, loyalty, and shared values. They were people who had seen Scarlett in her grief, in her joy, and in her quiet, relentless pursuit of a meaningful life. By nightfall, the snow was coming down in a blinding horizontal fury, piling up against the tall windows of the great room. Inside, however, Ironwood was a fortress of warmth and golden light. Scarlett sat alone in the leather wingback chair by the fire, a crystal glass of bourbon in her hand. The silence of the house was profound, broken only by the crackle of the burning logs and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. She looked around at the magnificent room, at the life she had built in the shadows, away from the judgmental, grasping hands of a society that only measured worth in visible price tags. She thought of Marcus, sitting in his sterile, freezing McMansion, likely being berated by Chloe about the placement of a floral arrangement. She felt a profound sadness for him, a mourning for the boy he used to be before he traded his substance for an illusion. He had chosen his path, and Scarlett had chosen hers. Tomorrow night, while Chloe desperately tried to impress a room full of strangers with gold-painted food and artificial joy, Scarlett would be surrounded by authentic love, profound intellect, and unapologetic black excellence. She took a slow sip of her bourbon, the liquid burning a warm path down her throat. She set the glass on the antique side table and reached for her phone. She didn't open her messages to check on Marcus. She opened her Instagram. Scarlett rarely posted, using the app primarily to follow art galleries and garden conservatories. But she had one follower who mattered very much right now. She tapped on the profile of Eleanor Vance, the undisputed queen of American lifestyle journalism. Scarlett typed a quick, direct message. Eleanor, the fires are lit at Ironwood. The 98 Chateauneuf is breathing. If you are tired of the city's plastic galas, your room is ready. She hit send. She didn't wait for a reply. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what kind of woman Eleanor was, and she knew that true elegance recognized its own. Scarlett closed her eyes, the heat of the fire sinking into her bones. The stage was set. The trap was laid. And the most exquisite part of it all was that she hadn't needed to lift a finger in malice. She only needed to live her truth, loudly and beautifully, and let the sheer, blinding light of her reality expose the pathetic shadows of theirs. Christmas Eve in Westchester arrived not with a sense of holy quiet, but with the frantic, thumping bass line of a Spotify electro swing playlist. Chloe's 5-bedroom McMansion had been entirely scrubbed of its usual sterile white aesthetic, replaced by a desperate, aggressive homage to the roaring 20s. Black velvet drapes covered the windows, shutting out the falling snow. Towering arrangements of white ostrich feathers and gold spray-painted palm leaves dominated every flat surface. Waiters in ill-fitting suspenders circulated with trays of miniature beef. Wellingtons and flute glasses filled with a Prosecco that Chloe had loudly and repeatedly referred to as vintage champagne. It was loud, it was crowded, and it was utterly devoid of joy. Marcus stood near the faux marble fireplace, nursing a tumbler of neat scotch. He wore a tuxedo that felt uncomfortably tight across the shoulders, his face fixed in a rigid, practiced smile as one of his senior partners droned on about golf course real estate in Boca Raton. Marcus nodded at the appropriate intervals, but his eyes were vacant. He felt a phantom ache in his chest, a low-level thrum of guilt that had been vibrating since his mother had quietly walked out of their dining room 3 days ago. He had tried calling Scarlett twice since then. It had gone straight to voicemail. Across the room, Chloe was vibrating with a terrifying, manic energy. She wore a beaded flapper dress that was entirely inappropriate for the freezing weather, a rhinestone headband biting into her forehead. She was working the room like a politician facing a recall election, laughing too loudly, touching the arms of the country club wives and darting her eyes constantly toward the heavy mahogany front door. "Have you seen her?" Chloe hissed, materializing suddenly at Marcus's side and digging perfectly manicured acrylic nails into his forearm. Marcus winced. "Seen who?" "Chloe, you're hurting me." "Eleanor! Eleanor Vance!" Chloe's voice was a tight, desperate whisper. "She was supposed to be here an hour ago. I told Susan and the rest of the board that Eleanor was my guest of honor. If she doesn't show up, I'm going to look like a social climbing liar. Maybe the snow delayed her driver," Marcus offered weakly, pulling his arm away. "Or maybe she just changed her mind. She's the editor of the biggest lifestyle magazine in the country, Chloe. She goes to A-list galas. Why would she come to a suburban Gatsby party?" Chloe glared at him, her eyes flashing with venom. "Because I spent 6 months cultivating her assistant Marcus. Because I bought an ad spread in her spring issue. She has to come." But as the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 9, Chloe's phone buzzed in her sequined clutch. She snatched it out, her face falling as she read the screen. It was an email from a junior assistant at the magazine. "Dear Mrs. Hayes, Ms. Vance sends her deepest regrets. Due to an unforeseen personal invitation of the highest priority, she will not be able to attend your holiday gathering tonight. Wishing you a festive season." Chloe stared at the screen, the color draining from her face beneath her heavy contouring. "Unforeseen personal invitation?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a potent mix of humiliation and rage. "Who the hell is more important than the Westchester Country Club board on Christmas Eve?" "Chloe, it's fine," Marcus said, trying to manage her impending meltdown. "The party is fine. Look, everyone is eating." "They are eating because the food is free, Marcus," she snapped, her voice cracking. She looked around the room. Without the promise of Eleanor Vance's arrival, the party suddenly looked exactly like what it was, a cheap, try-hard imitation of wealth. The gold paint on the palm leaves was flaking. The string quartet looked bored. The corporate wives were whispering behind their hands. It was a suffocating golden cage, and Chloe was trapped inside it. 90 miles north, the snow was falling in thick, heavy curtains, burying the Catskill Mountains in a pristine blanket of white. But inside Ironwood Manor, the winter storm was merely a beautiful backdrop to a masterpiece of human warmth. The great room glowed with the amber light of the roaring stone fireplace and dozens of beeswax candles. Dr. Eris Thorne sat near the 12-foot, unadorned fir tree, his eyes closed as he pulled his bow across the strings of his antique cello, filling the cavernous space with the rich, melancholy strains of Bach. At the massive salvaged oak dining table, 24 people sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces illuminated by candlelight and genuine laughter. There was no posturing here. Reverend Elias Jenkins was in the middle of a booming, hilarious story about a choir rivalry from the 1980s, tears of mirth streaming down his face. Maya, the young architect, was deep in a passionate debate with Mr. Miller, the farmer, about the soil composition of the Hudson Valley. At the head of the table sat Scarlett. She was a vision. She wore the emerald green velvet gown, the fabric catching the firelight and complementing the deep, rich mahogany of her skin. The heirloom pearls rested against her collarbone, glowing with a soft, lunar light. She did not look like a frail widow, nor did she look like someone who needed to be shipped off to a senior retreat. She looked regal. She looked like a woman who owned her history, her space, and her power. She was just pouring a glass of the 1998 Chateauneuf du Pape for Elias when Thomas, the estate manager, stepped into the dining room. He leaned down, whispering discreetly into Scarlett's ear. "A car has just cleared the security gates, ma'am. A Bentley. The driver says he has a guest." Scarlett's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. "Please show her in, Thomas, and bring another setting." A hush fell over the table as the heavy front doors opened, letting in a swirl of icy wind and snowflakes, followed immediately by the sharp, unmistakable click of designer heels on the chestnut floorboards. Into the warm light of the great room stepped Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was a legend. With her signature silver bob, impeccably tailored black Saint Laurent tuxedo suit, and an aura of absolute, intimidating authority, she dictated the tastes of millions of American women. She was a woman who could make or break a designer with a single sentence. Eris stopped playing his cello. Maya gasped softly. Even Reverend Elias paused mid-sentence. They all recognized her. Eleanor handed her snow-dusted cashmere coat to Thomas, her sharp, intelligent eyes scanning the room. She took in the sweeping stone arches, the original Black American artwork, the roaring fire, and finally, the long table of diverse, laughing guests. Her gaze landed on Scarlett at the head of the table. Eleanor's famously icy demeanor melted instantly. A radiant, genuine smile broke across her face. "Well," Eleanor said, her voice a sophisticated, smoky purr. "It only took you 15 years to finally invite me to the fortress, Scarlett." Scarlett stood up, stepping away from the table. She walked toward the most powerful woman in American media and embraced her warmly. "You know I hate the city in December, Elle," Scarlett replied, kissing her friend's cheek. "I knew the only way to get you out of those dreadful corporate galas was to offer you decent wine and a real fire." "You always did know my weaknesses," Eleanor laughed, pulling back to look at Scarlett. "You look magnificent. That velvet? Is that vintage Oscar de la Renta?" "It is. And you are late. Sit down, we saved you the best cut of the prime rib." As Eleanor took her seat, the table erupted in polite, awed murmurs. Aris Thorne leaned forward, unable to contain his curiosity. "Ms. Vance, forgive my intrusion, but how on earth do you know our Scarlett?" Eleanor took a sip of the Chateauneuf du Pape, closing her eyes in appreciation before answering. "Scarlett and I met in 1978. We were both graduate students at Columbia University. I was a terrified, broke journalism student from the Midwest pretending to be a New York socialite, and Scarlett was the brilliant, terrifying literature scholar who saw right through me. We shared a walk-up apartment in Harlem the size of a shoebox. She taught me how to read Faulkner, and I taught her how to mix a passable martini with cheap gin." Scarlett chuckled, shaking her head. She was a menace, but she had a good heart. "Scarlett is the only person in the world who has never been impressed by me," Eleanor said, looking around the table with deep affection. "In my world, everyone wants something. Everyone is performing. But coming here and seeing this incredible sanctuary she and Robert built," Eleanor gestured to the stone walls and the roaring fire. "This is the only place in New York where I can simply breathe. This is what true elegance looks like." The dinner resumed, the energy in the room elevating with Eleanor's magnetic presence. There was no talk of stock portfolios or country club memberships. They talked about art, about civil rights, about the beauty of the snow falling outside. It was a feast of the mind and the soul. By 10:30, the plates had been cleared, and Sarah brought out a towering dark chocolate and blood orange tart. Aris resumed playing his cello, a lively, soaring piece that made the guests tap their feet. Eleanor sat back in her chair, a crystal glass of port wine in her hand, watching her oldest friend. Scarlett was laughing at a joke Elias had made, her head thrown back, the firelight catching the emerald velvet and the flawless pearls. She looked completely, utterly free. Eleanor Vance famously detested social media. Her assistants ran her accounts, posting highly curated editorials and magazine covers. She had once famously declared in an interview that documenting a party while you are in it is the quickest way to kill the magic. But tonight Eleanor reached into her tuxedo jacket and pulled out her personal iPhone. She didn't ask for permission. She simply raised the phone and snapped a single, candid photograph. She captured Scarlett mid-laugh, raising her glass. The composition was accidental perfection. The rustic stone, the roaring fire, the rich colors, and at the center, a black woman radiating an untouchable, majestic grace. Eleanor opened Instagram. She didn't use a filter. The photo didn't need one. She typed a caption with her fast, practiced thumbs. "I spend my life attending the most exclusive events in the world, searching for what it means to be truly elegant. Tonight I found it. No plastic, no pretense. Just history, authentic warmth, and the quiet, undeniable majesty of a woman who knows exactly who she is. America desperately needs more of this grounded, beautiful grace. Thank you to my dearest, oldest friend, Scarlett Hayes, for hosting me at her breathtaking historic estate, Ironwood Manor. A Christmas Eve I will never forget." She tagged the location as upstate New York, hit share to her 4.5 million followers, and quietly put her phone away. Meanwhile, in Westchester, the Gatsby party was dying a slow, agonizing death. It was 10:45 p.m. The mini beef Wellingtons were cold. The string quartet had packed up and left. Only about 20 guests remained, mostly those who had consumed too much Prosecco to safely drive. Chloe was standing by the kitchen island, furiously refreshing her email, praying for a follow-up apology from Eleanor's assistant. Marcus was sitting on a bar stool, staring blankly at the marble counter, rubbing his temples. Suddenly, a loud ping cut through the low murmur of the room. It came from the phone of Susan Harrington, the notoriously judgmental president of the Westchester Country Club. Susan was standing by the faux fireplace. She looked at her screen, her perfectly plucked eyebrows shooting up into her hairline. She gasped, a sharp, audible intake of air that caused the three women standing next to her to stop talking. "Susan, what is it?" one of the wives asked. Susan didn't answer. Her eyes darted wildly from her phone, across the room, and landed directly on Marcus and Chloe. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Another ping, then three more in rapid succession. Suddenly, half the phones in the room were lighting up with notifications. Everyone who cared about social status in New York followed Eleanor Vance, and Eleanor Vance had just posted for the first time in 3 months. Chloe felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. She watched as Susan marched across the living room, her heels clicking aggressively. She bypassed Chloe entirely and stopped directly in front of Marcus. "Marcus," Susan said, her voice tight, pitching loud enough for the entire room to hear. She thrust her glowing iPhone screen into his face. Is this your mother?" Marcus blinked, pulling his head back to focus on the screen. He saw a woman in a breathtaking emerald gown, laughing in front of a massive stone fireplace. He saw the pearls he recognized from his childhood. He saw the caption, "Dearest, oldest friend, breathtaking historic estate, Ironwood Manor." Marcus felt the floor drop out from under him. The air was sucked from his lungs. Yes, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "That's my mother." Chloe snatched the phone out of Susan's hand. Her eyes scanned the image, then the text. "Eleanor Vance, dearest friend, estate." "This is a fake," Chloe blurted out, her voice shrill and panicked. "This is AI. Scarlett lives in a 3-bedroom house. She wears coupons. She doesn't know Eleanor Vance." Susan snatched her phone back, looking at Chloe with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "It is from Eleanor's verified account, Chloe, and she tagged the location. People are already in the comments confirming Ironwood is a 50-acre historic preservation site, worth at least $10 million. Susan took a step back, looking around at the gold-painted palm leaves, the cheap black velvet drapes, and the plastic Prosecco flutes. The illusion was broken. "You told me," Susan continued, her voice dripping with venomous condescension, "that your mother-in-law couldn't attend tonight because she was feeling fragile, and you had sent her to a senior care facility for her own comfort." The remaining guests had stopped pretending to politely ignore the scene. They were all staring, their faces illuminated by the glow of their own phones as they read Eleanor's post. The contrast was devastating, violent, and absolute. They were standing in a suffocating, tacky suburban box, realizing that the real elite, the real power, and the real elegance were 90 miles north, laughing by a fire, leaving them in the dust. We didn't know," Marcus choked out, standing up. He felt sick to his stomach. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His mother hadn't just survived his betrayal. She had transcended it. She had let them play their pathetic, cruel little games, knowing all along she held the entire board. "How embarrassing for you," Susan said coldly. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. Her pity was infinitely worse than her anger. To have royalty in your family, and to treat her like a peasant because you were too blind to recognize the crown. Susan turned to her husband. "Richard, get our coats. We're leaving." It was the signal. Like water draining from a cracked basin, the remaining guests suddenly found urgent reasons to depart. The babysitter is texting. The snow is getting worse. Early morning tomorrow. They couldn't get out of the house fast enough. None of them made eye contact with Chloe. Within 10 minutes, the house was entirely empty, save for Marcus and Chloe. The Spotify playlist had ended, leaving a deafening silence. Chloe stood in the center of the living room, her flapper dress suddenly looking like a cheap Halloween costume. She stared at the floor, her chest heaving, the realization of her absolute social annihilation washing over her. She was ruined in Westchester. She would be the laughingstock of the club by morning. Marcus didn't look at her. He looked at his own phone, pulling up Instagram to look at the photo again. He stared at the face of the mother he had thrown away. A woman of impossible wealth and untouchable grace. A woman he suddenly realized he didn't know at all. He slumped back onto the bar stool, buried his face in his hands, and wept. The morning of December 26th broke over Westchester with a harsh, glaring winter light that offered no warmth and forgave no sins. Inside the McMansion, the aftermath of the Gatsby party looked like the ruins of a failed empire. Deflated gold balloons pooled in the corners like dead jellyfish. The smell of stale Prosecco and abandoned seafood canapes hung heavy in the overheated air. Marcus sat at the kitchen island, still wearing the wrinkled tuxedo trousers and undershirt from 2 nights ago. His phone sat on the marble counter, plugged into the charger, the screen dark. He didn't need to look at it anymore. He had memorized Eleanor Vance's Instagram post. He had spent 48 hours staring at the photograph of his mother, radiant, powerful, and entirely out of his reach. His social and professional circles had not been kind in the intervening day. Marcus had received dozens of text messages, not to wish him a Merry Christmas, but to fish for gossip. "Is it true your mom owns Ironwood? Susan said you tried to put a multimillionaire in a nursing home. Why didn't you ever mention your family was old money?" He had ignored them all. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it difficult to draw a full breath. He had traded his mother's unconditional love for the fleeting approval of people who had abandoned his house the moment the illusion of his superiority shattered. The sharp clicking of heels broke the silence. Chloe marched into the kitchen. Unlike Marcus, who looked like a man standing before a firing squad, Chloe vibrated with a dangerous, frenetic energy. She had spent the first 24 hours crying, screaming at Marcus, and mourning the death of her country club ambitions. Susan Harrington had officially blocked her number. Her social climbing in Westchester was permanently over. But sometime during the night, Chloe's despair had curdled into a cold, desperate greed. Her survival instincts, the same ruthless instincts that had driven her to curate her perfect suburban life, had pivoted. "Stop moping!" Chloe snapped, dropping a legal pad onto the marble counter. "Crying isn't going to fix this. We need to be strategic." Marcus looked at her, his eyes bloodshot. "Strategic? Chloe, it's over. My mother knows exactly what we did. She knows exactly who we are." "Oh, grow up, Marcus," Chloe hissed, leaning over the counter, her eyes wide and feverish. "Do you realize what we are looking at? That estate is worth $15, maybe $20 million. Eleanor Vance said she's an art patron. Do you know how much a portfolio like that generates? She lied to us, Marcus. She sat at our table, wearing thrift store sweaters, acting like a burden, while she was sitting on a mountain of cash. Our cash." Marcus stared at his wife, a wave of profound revulsion washing over him. "It's not our cash, Chloe. It's hers. My father's." "You are her only child." Chloe slammed her hand on the counter. "You are the sole heir. We don't need Susan Harrington or her pathetic little golf club. If we have that kind of money, we can buy a penthouse in Manhattan. We can move to the Hamptons. They'll be begging us to attend their galas. But we need to secure it before she does something crazy, like leave it to a cat sanctuary." Marcus felt a fresh wave of exhaustion pull at his bones. He wanted to argue, to tell Chloe that she was missing the entire point of his mother's lesson, but he lacked the strength. He had been weak for so long that weakness was his default setting. "Call Arthur," Chloe commanded, tapping the legal pad. "Call your father's estate lawyer. Find out exactly what the legal structure is. Today." Arthur Pendleton was a senior partner at a white shoe law firm in Manhattan. He was a man of old-world sensibilities, tailored suits, and impeccable discretion. He had been Robert Hayes's closest confidant and the architect of the Hayes family's legal affairs for 30 years. Marcus sat in his home office, the phone on speaker, while Chloe hovered behind his chair like a hawk. The phone rang 3 times before the lawyer answered. "Arthur Pendleton." His voice was crisp and dry, like autumn leaves. "Arthur, hi. It's Marcus Hayes. I hope I'm not interrupting your holidays." There was a distinct, chilling pause on the other end of the line. "Marcus, I cannot say I am entirely surprised to hear from you today. I assume you have seen the photograph." Marcus flushed, humiliated that even his father's lawyer knew of his public disgrace. "Yes. Arthur, I had no idea about the extent of the estate. My mother never disclosed any of this to me." "Your mother," Arthur replied smoothly, "was under no legal or moral obligation to disclose her financial portfolio to a grown man with his own career, Marcus. The assets belong entirely to her." Chloe leaned down, her face close to the microphone. "Mr. Pendleton, this is Chloe Hayes. With all due respect, Marcus is the sole heir. We are very concerned about Scarlett's state of mind. Keeping a secret of this magnitude, it's highly irregular. We need to know what protections are in place for Marcus's inheritance. Another pause. When Arthur spoke again, the temperature of his voice had dropped below freezing. "Mrs. Hayes, your concern is noted, though entirely misplaced," Arthur said. "Robert Hayes was a brilliant man. He foresaw the complexities that accompany substantial wealth. Before his passing, he and Scarlett established an irrevocable blind trust. All assets, the tech equities, the municipal bonds, and the deeds to all real estate, including Ironwood Manor, are held within this trust." Marcus frowned. "Okay, but as the only son, I'm the default beneficiary, right? If something happens to her?" "No, Marcus, you are not," Arthur said. The words hit the room like a physical blow. "The trust is governed by an independent board of directors. Your mother is the primary beneficiary during her lifetime. Upon her passing, the trust does not automatically liquidate or transfer to you." "That's illegal!" Chloe shrieked, losing her composure entirely. "He's the next of kin. You can't just write a child out of an estate that size." "It is perfectly legal, ironclad, and entirely impenetrable, Mrs. Hayes," Arthur replied, thoroughly unbothered by her outburst. "Robert specifically designed it to prevent predatory behavior. In fact, there is a specific codicil regarding you, Marcus. You cannot access a single cent of the trust's dividends unless you pass a rigorous character evaluation conducted by the board." "A character evaluation?" Marcus whispered, the color draining from his face. "Yes. It requires, among other things, 500 documented hours of community service in underprivileged sectors, and a unanimous vote from the board confirming that you possess the moral fortitude to handle the wealth responsibly. Given recent social developments, I suspect the board would view any current application with extreme skepticism." Marcus closed his eyes. The trap hadn't just been sprung. It had been built 15 years ago by his own father. They had known. Even back then, Robert and Scarlett had known that Marcus possessed a fatal flaw, a weakness of character that needed to be mitigated. "Arthur, wait," Marcus started. "I have another call, Marcus," Arthur interrupted smoothly. "I strongly advise you to reflect on the choices that led you to this moment. Good day to you both." The line went dead. Chloe stood frozen behind the chair, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. If she was going to be a pariah in Westchester, she was going to drag Scarlett down into the mud with her. She stormed out of the office, her mind racing. What did she know about upstate New York? It was heavily regulated. Environmental protections, historical codes, zoning laws. Chloe herself had once spent 6 months fighting her local zoning board just to build a pergola over her patio. Scarlett had turned a 1700s farmhouse into a massive commercial-grade event space. A massive estate called Ironwood Manor. "Ah, Ironwood," David said. His tone didn't sound alarmed, it sounded fond. "Beautiful property. What seems to be the issue, ma'am?" "The issue," Chloe said sharply, "is rampant, unpermitted commercial activity. The owner is running a large-scale event venue, hosting massive gatherings, and operating what I suspect is an unpermitted commercial kitchen. Hayes is the largest private donor to our county's Infrastructure and Preservation Fund. Furthermore, she doesn't just follow the compliance codes. She writes them." "What are you talking about?" Chloe whispered, a cold dread pooling in her stomach. "Mrs. Scarlett Hayes," David said, enunciating every word clearly, "is the chairwoman of the County Historical Preservation Board. She was appointed by the governor 3 years ago. Scarlett hadn't just built a house. She had built an empire, fortified it with millions of dollars, surrounded it with legal armor, and embedded herself into the very fabric of the local government." Scarlett was untouchable. Marcus was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. He had watched the entire phone call. He looked at the phone on the floor, then up at his wife. He saw the absolute crushing defeat in her eyes. The heater in the Range Rover blew warm air, but the interior of the car felt as cold as a crypt. In the passenger seat, Chloe sat rigidly, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed blindly on the snow-covered pines blurring past her window. The manic, plodding energy that had consumed her all morning had completely evaporated, replaced by a hollow, paralyzing dread. She had run out of moves. The board had been flipped, the pieces scattered, and she was finally forced to look at the woman sitting across from her, not as a pawn, but as the grandmaster. Marcus's mind, however, was not on the money. As the elevation climbed and the cell service dropped away, The corporate anxieties that had ruled his life for a decade began to strip away, revealing the raw, aching wound beneath. He thought about his 8-year-old son, Leo, who was currently back at the house with the weekend nanny. Chloe had insisted on a child-free Christmas Eve to accommodate the aesthetic of the Gatsby party. Marcus realized, with a sickening jolt of clarity, that he was raising his son in a sterile vacuum, devoid of the deep, unconditional family warmth he himself had known as a child. He had allowed Chloe to edit his mother out of their lives, and by extension, out of Leo's. "Turn left at the next fork," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the tires. She was reading the GPS coordinates David from the zoning office had inadvertently confirmed. Marcus turned the wheel. The pristine asphalt gave way to a winding, snow-packed county road. 10 minutes later, they arrived at the massive wrought iron gates of Ironwood Manor. Even forewarned, the sheer scale of the property was staggering. The gates, forged with intricate vines and heavy steel, stood like sentinels against the ancient forest. Beyond them, a long, winding driveway disappeared into a canopy of frosted hemlocks. Marcus rolled down his window and pressed the intercom button on the stone pillar. The freezing air bit at his face. "Yes?" a deep, unfamiliar voice answered. It was Thomas. "This is Marcus Hayes," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly. I'm here to see my mother." There was a long, agonizing pause. The silence stretched so taut that Marcus thought the connection had been severed. Then, with a heavy mechanical groan, the massive iron gates began to swing slowly inward. Marcus drove the Range Rover up the winding path. When they finally broke through the tree line, Ironwood Manor loomed before them in all its breathtaking, rustic majesty. The hand-hewn stone, the soaring chimneys, the sheer, grounded permanence of the estate made Chloe's Westchester McMansion look like a house made of cheap imported plastic. It was a fortress of history and quiet money. They parked near the carriage house. As they stepped out into the biting cold, the heavy oak front door of the main house opened. Thomas stepped out onto the wide, wraparound porch, his expression neutral but unyielding. "Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Hayes," Thomas said, nodding briefly. "Your mother is expecting you. She is on the west veranda." They followed Thomas through the great room. Chloe's eyes darted frantically, taking in the wide plank chestnut floors, the original Black American art, and the remnants of a spectacular feast on the long oak dining table. She could smell the lingering scent of wood smoke, roasted meats, and expensive wine. It was the scent of a world she had desperately tried to buy her way into, only to realize she had married a man whose mother already owned it. Thomas led them to a set of heavy glass doors opening onto a massive covered veranda that overlooked the snow-dusted valley. Heat lamps cast a warm amber glow against the freezing air. Scarlett was sitting in a high-backed wicker chair, wrapped in a thick, luxurious charcoal-gray cashmere shawl. A steaming cup of tea rested on the small table beside her. She was not wearing her emerald velvet gown today. She was back in her simple linen tunic and a cardigan. Yet, framed against the vast, wild backdrop of the mountains, she looked more intimidating than any CEO Marcus had ever faced. "Mother," Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper. He stopped a few feet away, suddenly terrified to step any closer. Scarlett did not stand. She took a slow sip of her tea, her dark eyes resting on them with a calm, penetrating clarity. There was no anger in her gaze, no triumph. There was only a profound, devastating disappointment. "Marcus." "Chloe," Scarlett said, her voice steady and rich. "I suppose you found the drive agreeable?" Chloe, unable to bear the silence, fell back on the only weapon she had left, the performance of victimhood. She rushed forward, tears welling perfectly in her eyes. "Mother Scarlett, we were so worried. You just disappeared. When we saw that photograph, we were in shock. Why would you keep such a massive secret from us? We're your family." Scarlett raised a single hand, her palm facing outward. The gesture was so quiet, yet so authoritative, that Chloe stopped dead in her tracks, the fake tears freezing on her cheeks. "Do not insult my intelligence, Chloe," Scarlett said softly. "You were not worried. You were embarrassed. You were humiliated in front of your country club friends, and then you were terrified when you realized the woman you tried to discard was holding the purse strings." Chloe opened her mouth, her face flushing a deep, mottled red, but no words came out. The absolute truth of Scarlett's statement stripped away every layer of her artifice. Marcus stepped in front of his wife, shoulders slumped. He looked like a man carrying a physical burden. "Mom, I don't even know what to say. I'm sorry. I am so deeply, profoundly sorry. Work has been so crazy. The merger, the pressure. I let things get out of control. I let Chloe handle the social calendar and I didn't pay attention. I was a coward. Yes, you were, Scarlett agreed, her tone unyielding. She set her teacup down with a soft click. But do not blame your cowardice on corporate mergers, Marcus. You traded your spine for a corner office, and you traded your moral compass for a quiet life at home. You allowed your wife to disrespect the woman who gave you life, who scrubbed floors to pay for your education, because it was easier than having a difficult conversation. Marcus flinched as if he had been struck. Tears, hot and shameful, spilled over his eyelashes. I know. God, Mom, I know. I hate the man I've become. I hate my life. But I need you. Please don't cut me out. We can fix this. Scarlett looked at her son, seeing the brokenness in his posture. For 15 years, she had waited for this moment. The moment the illusion shattered and he was forced to look at his own reflection. You didn't come here today to apologize to a mother whose feelings you hurt, Marcus, Scarlett said, her voice laced with a tragic sadness. You came here to negotiate with a millionaire. If I had truly been the poor, dependent widow you believed me to be, you would be sitting by your artificial fireplace right now, congratulating yourselves on successfully exiling me to a senior care facility. The truth of it hung in the freezing air, heavy and inescapable. Marcus dropped to his knees on the wooden deck. He didn't care about his designer coat. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with genuine racking sobs. I'm sorry, he wept, a broken mantra. I'm so sorry. Chloe stood frozen behind him, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at Scarlett with a mixture of terror and awe. She had spent her entire adult life trying to project power through labels and zip codes. Now she was witnessing true power, the power of absolute self-possession, of a woman who needed nothing and feared no one. Scarlett watched her son weep. Her heart ached, the biological, instinctual ache of a mother seeing her child in pain, but she did not move to comfort him. To comfort him now would be to rob him of the consequence he desperately needed to endure. Get up, Marcus, Scarlett said finally. Marcus slowly rose, wiping his face with the back of his sleeve, looking entirely stripped of his corporate arrogance. I am not going to banish you from my life, Scarlett said, the words falling like heavy stones into the silence. Not because you deserve my forgiveness, but because you have a son. Leo is 8 years old. He is innocent in this pathetic theater of vanity you two have constructed. He needs his grandmother. And more importantly, he needs an example of what dignity looks like, because he is certainly not learning it in your house. Chloe let out a small, shuddering breath of relief, but Scarlett's eyes snapped to her, sharp as obsidian. Do not mistake my mercy for weakness, Chloe, Scarlett warned. The days of your passive-aggressive insults, your condescension, and your transparent social climbing are over. You are standing on my ground now, and on my ground my rules are absolute. Scarlett stood up, wrapping the cashmere shawl tighter around her shoulders. She walked to the edge of the veranda, looking out over the 50 acres of pristine, protected land. You spoke to Arthur Pendleton this morning, so you know the truth, Scarlett said, not looking back at them. The money is in a blind trust. It will never belong to you. Upon my death, the majority of the estate will be liquidated and transferred to a scholarship fund for underprivileged Black students pursuing the arts and historical preservation. The remainder will be placed in a heavily guarded educational trust for Leo. Marcus nodded slowly. I don't care about the money, Mom. I swear to you. I just want my mother back. If you want me in your life, you will earn it. Scarlett turned to face them, her posture radiating an immovable strength. You will not earn it with expensive gifts, or forced dinners, or empty apologies. You will earn it through action. She leveled her gaze at them. You thought a senior care facility was the appropriate place to dispose of me. Therefore, both of you will complete 500 hours of community service at the county's underfunded, state-run nursing homes. You will sweep floors. You will read to the residents whose families abandoned them. You will wipe tables, and you will learn, firsthand, the value and the humanity of the elderly. Chloe's jaw dropped. The thought of ruining her manicures, of stepping foot into a state-run facility, was abhorrent to her. 500 hours? Mother Scarlett, I have charity galas to plan. You have nothing, Chloe. Scarlett cut her off, her voice cracking like a whip. Your social standing in Westchester is ashes. You have a choice. You either do the work, or you walk down that driveway and never contact me again. Furthermore, the two of you will enroll in weekly intensive family therapy. You will learn how to communicate without manipulation, and Marcus, you will learn how to locate your spine. Scarlett looked back and forth between them. Those are my terms. They are not negotiable. If you agree, you may bring Leo to visit me on the first weekend of every month. If you refuse, Thomas will escort you off the property immediately. The silence on the veranda was absolute, save for the wind whistling through the pines. Marcus didn't look at his wife. He didn't ask for her permission. He looked at his mother, the woman he had underestimated, disrespected, and deeply wounded, and he saw the lifeline she was throwing him. It was a lifeline covered in thorns, demanding blood and sweat, but it was the only way to pull himself out of the toxic swamp his life had become. I accept, Marcus said, his voice firming up for the first time in years. I'll do the hours. I'll do the therapy. Whatever it takes. He turned to Chloe. We accept. Chloe looked at the vast, multi-million-dollar estate, then at her ruined husband, and finally at the imposing, regal woman in the wicker chair. She swallowed her pride, a bitter, jagged pill. She gave a single, slow nod. Good, Scarlett said, sitting back down and picking up her teacup. Now, you may both leave. The drive back to Westchester is long, and I have a garden to plan for the spring. 15 months later, the brutal freeze of upstate New York had surrendered to the lush, vibrant explosion of late spring. Ironwood Manor was bathed in golden sunlight, the 50 acres alive with blooming wildflowers, humming bees, and the rich, earthy scent of damp soil. On the edge of the sprawling back lawn, near the tree line, a 9-year-old boy with bright, inquisitive eyes was kneeling in the dirt. Leo Hayes had dirt smudged across his nose and was holding a small gardening trowel with intense concentration. Like this, Grandma? Leo asked, carefully patting the dark soil around the base of a small, thorny green offshoot. Scarlett knelt beside him. She wore her familiar linen tunic and a wide-brimmed straw hat. She smiled, reaching out to gently adjust the boy's hands. Perfect, my love. That is a Rosa serratea, a wild rose. It has thick thorns and it requires a lot of patience. But if you plant it deep and you give it strong roots, it will survive any winter. Will it bloom this year? Leo asked, looking up at her with adoration. Not this year, Scarlett said softly, brushing a speck of dirt from his cheek. Real growth takes time, Leo. You cannot rush something that is meant to last. A rhythmic, heavy sound echoed from across the yard. Thwack! Thwack! Scarlett looked up. Near the carriage house, Marcus was swinging a heavy steel axe, splitting firewood for the upcoming winter. He wore a faded t-shirt, drenched in sweat, his hands calloused and rough. He looked tired, but the permanent, frantic exhaustion that used to define his features was gone. There was a grounded solidity to him now. He had completed 300 hours at the state nursing home. He had sat with dying men. He had cleaned up messes. He had listened. The corporate veneer had cracked, allowing a genuine, humble man to finally breathe beneath it. Chloe was inside the kitchen with Sarah, learning how to bake a peach cobbler from scratch. She was quieter these days. The therapy was grueling, stripping away her narcissism layer by agonizing layer. She was not perfect. She still occasionally fretted over brands and appearances, but the terrifying reality of almost losing everything had fundamentally shifted her worldview. She had learned the hard way that true power could not be worn. It had to be possessed internally. Marcus paused, wiping his brow with his forearm, and looked across the lawn. He saw his mother and his son kneeling together in the earth, bathed in the afternoon sun. He smiled, a real unburdened smile, and raised a hand in greeting. Scarlett raised her hand in return. She stood up, looking at the estate she had built, the family she had disciplined, and the legacy she was securing. She had not sought revenge. Revenge was an acid that burned the vessel that held it. She had sought justice, and she had demanded respect. She had wielded her wealth not as a weapon to destroy, but as an impenetrable shield to protect her dignity, and as a tool to forge a better future for the boy in the dirt beside her. Scarlett took a deep breath of the sweet spring air. The pruning was complete. The dead wood had been cut away, and finally, her garden was ready to bloom.